Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar titled Shining a Light on the Opportunities of Endpoint Assessment. We thank you for joining us this afternoon. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to explain a few things about our webinar platform to allow you to get the most out of the experience. All viewers will be in listen-only mode. However, to engage with the webinar, please use the on-screen panels. Using the tabs of this panel, you can adjust your audio settings and choose to see the webcam of our presenters if available. You can also use the questions tab to engage with us. We expect that our webinar will be extremely popular, that our team will do our best to answer your questions and queries. During our webinar, we'll be running a number of polls. To record your response, please click on the on-screen voting button when asked to do so. After the webinar, we will be providing a recording of the webinar, a copy of the slides, and a fact sheet to address any unanswered questions. Now, I'd like to hand over to our presenter, Bill Twigg.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this City and Guilds webinar. Today, I would like to take you through an agenda which will consist of the following. To start, we would like to make sure everybody can get on board, and we start from an appropriate point. We're going to recap on the apprenticeship policy briefly during this presentation. We're going to look a little bit deeper into endpoint assessment, and then we're going to look at working with City and Guilds as a partner in endpoint assessment going forward. We will then be open to questions and answers, which we will address as many as possible during the webinar, and obviously we will promise to come back to you with any outstanding questions through our communications. So to start us off, I'd like to ask Jodie to take us through the first poll.
Okay, so we have a quick poll question here, which I'm just going to launch now. So the poll question is, are you already offering new apprenticeship programs? It's a simple yes or no answer. I'll give you some time to vote. Okay, so it looks like the majority of you are yes.
Excellent. Well, I think that will obviously, hopefully, what we'll discuss today will add that value to your current business opportunities. Okay, so if we turn to the next slide, what we're going to do is just remind ourselves of the overview of the changes of the reforms and why we are in the position we are today. The government, subject to the new party getting in being the same as the old, is still committed to reach the 3 million apprenticeship starts by 2020. We will actually, the government will introduce the Employer Apprenticeship Levee, which has just been introduced in April 2017, and this new tax will actually be paid by employers who are earning more, have a wage bill greater than £3 million, and they'll be taxed at 0.5% on that, to establish a levy pot. The public employers statutory duty to employ a percentage of their own workforce in apprentices. So we have certain areas where, if you are actual public sector employers, as an employer, you have to present a certain percentage of your workforce as apprentices going forward. We are also looking at changes to the profile, where all new apprenticeship delivery organisations have to achieve the new standard and be on the register for the ROATP. So the four main things that are changing. In the first instance, we have trailblazers groups, which are basically groups of employers who are taking responsibility for the actual apprenticeship standard. This replaces the current system of SACE frameworks, which used to be regulated and run by the sector skills councils. There will be an enormous uplift in the number of standards available, more than what the frameworks were. We were looking for probably 4 or 5-fold the number of standards to be established to replace the old frameworks of 250. And each new standard will be consulted on before it gets the status of ready for delivery. We are also looking that the earlier published standards will be reassessed during this very short time period. Some of them have actually been alive now for nearly 3 years. The four main things that are changing. Number two is the apprenticeships are being designed to be more flexible. This has manifested itself as qualifications no longer being mandatory in apprenticeships. There are a number of apprenticeships that have special dispensation, particularly around technical areas like engineering, where qualifications have survived as part of the on-programme delivery. But in the majority of cases, qualifications are no longer relevant to apprenticeships. We've had the introduction of endpoint assessment, which is basically a validation of the successful apprentice during the end of their apprenticeship programme. And that each of these endpoint assessments will be carried out independently from the deliverer or provider providing the on-programme element of the apprenticeships. The basis of these changes are to ensure that employers benefit from the more relevant and flexible approach delivering skills to their businesses. I'd like to now ask Judy to take poll 2.
Okay, moving on to the second poll question. So, how comfortable do you feel with your level of understanding of the levee? So we have somewhat comfortable, very comfortable, not comfortable at all. Okay. So it looks like a lot of you, just over half, are somewhat comfortable.
That's very good progress, because it wasn't so long ago where the levee was a bit of a black art, and quite a lot of providers, in particular FE colleges, were finding it a challenge in the way that they do business. So that's great progress that we've seen. Moving on to the next slide, we'd like to look at a little bit more detail about the levee. And for those that weren't so sure about it, let's just reinforce where the levee actually sits. If you are an employer and you have a wage salary bill of under £3 million, then you are a non-levee payer. So basically, your contribution to apprenticeships will be a 10% fee for the apprenticeships that are undertaken from be paid by the employer in most cases. There are some exemptions with small organisations or with certain age profiles. If you are an employer that's paying a £3 million, in excess of £3 million on your wage salary bill, then basically you'll be paying the levee. This PAYE approach will collect the 0.5% tax and will be put into a digital account that will be made accessible to you as an employer, to the employer, to be able to spend on apprenticeships. This money is ring-fenced and it is only for apprenticeships. In claiming back your levee or engaging with an apprenticeship, when an apprenticeship has been ready for delivery, it is also allocated two things. One is a LARS number to enable the provider to register the apprenticeship on the appropriate apprenticeship, and the second, it will have a band which will be basically the upper limit for the cost of that particular apprenticeship. As you can see, there are 15 bands now, ranging from £1,500 to £27,000. The old system was a band from 1 to 6 was dropped during April this year. Also, at that point, it is not just now the new apprenticeship standards that fit into this banding process, but also the old existing SACE frameworks. For as long as they be fundable, they will be allocated a band in line with one of the 15 as shown on the slide. So, as a provider, you will be looking at having to consider dual systems to be able to start an apprentice for an employer, depending upon whether they are a levy payer or non-levy payer. If they are a levy payer, then basically the top scenario is what you would be going through. So the employer will pay the levy, and then the levy account will be open. They would negotiate a price with you. When we talk about the value of these top of the bands, that is basically the maximum that can be paid, but the employer has a right to negotiate a price for the apprenticeship if they feel they could get better value for money. And then basically the employer will be paying monthly deductions to the provider through the levy system. And then basically what will happen is that the co-investment, and if you run short in your particular account and you want more apprentices than what the account can afford, then you will drop into the other system where you would have to pay a 10% for every new apprentice that is actually started as the employer. If you're the non-levy paying employer, then employer funds will have to fund the apprenticeship. Once again, they would go for an agreement with you as a provider for the price of that apprenticeship, and the employer will have to contribute his 10% to the overall cost. The employer must be invoiced, and that invoice must be actually go through the accounts of the provider, because this will be an audit point going forward to ensure that the employer has paid a contribution for that apprenticeship. And once again, the co-investment of 9-to-1, which is fundamentally a 10% contribution, is the basis of the calculation.
Okay, so we've got another whole question here. So, how many of you are working closely with employers to support their implementation of the apprenticeship? So we are working closely with employers, we are not working closely. Okay. It looks like a lot of you are already working closely with employers.
Once again, this is marvellous progress as the system starts to take hold and we move away from the old traditional SACE frameworks. What we'd like to do now is go to the next slide. Wrong way.
Sorry, we seem to have a problem with the Powerplay.
One more slide. Okay, here we are. We're back on track. Thanks for your patience. What we have here is just a little reminder that apprenticeships are still apprenticeships. Now, our key things which are clearly important. The new apprenticeship standards will have the requirement of initial assessment to make sure that we get the right apprentice in the right job. The off-the-job training is a minimum of 20%. And qualifications may not be mandatory, so there may be new challenges how you can record for audit purposes the off-the-job training of apprenticeships. Maths and English will still be required. Level 2 Maths and English for a Level 3 apprenticeship, and for a Level 2 apprenticeship, Level 1 in most cases. And then we'll be introducing the need to assess behaviours, and the behaviours have been designed for each occupation. Once we get to the gateway, what we are looking for then is that the apprentices completed their apprenticeship, and we move, and only then should we move forward to endpoint assessment, because endpoint assessment isn't an area where any further development or training takes place. It's basically verification that the apprentice has now mastery of his occupational trade. The apprenticeship certificate will be issued by the endpoint assessment organisation, or applied for to the SFA, and that certificate will be sent directly to the employer for them to issue it to the apprentice. And at that point, the occupation competence will be deemed as complete. It is also worthwhile noting that when you get to the gateway, endpoint assessment cannot take place unless the candidate, the apprentice, has been successful in the Maths and English. So, the overall intention is that by 2020, the majority of apprenticeships under action implemented will be new standards, and the SACE frameworks will be in the minority.
Okay, so we have another 2 poll questions for you. The first poll question is, how many of you have worked with employers using apprenticeships for the roles that were previously filled by graduates? So we have or we have not. It's time for you to get your votes in. Okay, so a lot of you haven't. Moving on to the next poll question. Do you need support to identify and develop a quality apprenticeship program that meets the needs of employers? Yes or no?
Ooh.
Votes are coming in. Well, it's about 50-50 at the moment. I'll give you a bit more time.
Cool. 50.
Okay. But it's 50-50, which is quite interesting.
That's a significant change in the last 12 months, where clearly the level of independence in the network is increasing as we're moving forward with the changes. Right, if we now go to the next slide. Okay, what I'd like to do is just look at a few endpoint assessment concerns or issues or areas where possibly this new environment may lead us into different areas.
So we're just trying to get the presentation back up and working.
Okay, so some of the basics is that clearly in the marketplace today, if you want to engage with an endpoint assessment activity, you can only contract with endpoint assessment organisations. These endpoint assessment organisations are on the actual register, the RAAO. So they are the only ones that can be actually engaged with for endpoint assessment. The endpoint assessment costs are included in the funding band as part of the overall cost. Employers must ensure that the prices negotiated with the provider include the amount needed for endpoint assessment. We are rather concerned that sometimes that as a provider, if you negotiate with an employer, is that you agree to a fee for endpoint assessment to ensure that there's enough funding made available to be able to purchase that service. As far as the levy or payment is concerned, the co-investment payments, 20% will be held back for endpoint assessment. So 80% would be for delivery, for on-program, but up to the cost of 20% will be used only for endpoint assessment. Where an endpoint assessment has been actually costed below the 20% margin, if a referral is required by an apprentice, then you can use any outstanding monies left of the 20% to pay towards a second chance at the endpoint assessment. However, once the 20% has been reached, then clearly if any further costs are incurred, that would have to be paid by the employer/provider. The endpoint assessment payment agreement for non-levy players must be included within the written agreement between the employer and provider. This isn't always. Now, this has really been picked up because a lot of the AOC work on the contracting that they've been offering out, and ALEP have been offering some good pro formas for these type of contracts, ensuring that these issues are covered. And also, as far as endpoint assessment, assurance quality and currency for learners, for employers, is that the endpoint assessment will be quality assured by a further independent body that had been identified by the employer group or the trailblazer. So, who is responsible for what? The employer chooses the endpoint assessment organisation, in theory, but we are also confident that they will get lots of good advice from the provider network. The contract with the endpoint assessment service, who contracts the endpoint, can only be the lead provider who is actually holding the apprenticeships records. This has caused some initial issues where subcontractors have not got the capability to actually engage an endpoint assessment organisation. So going forward, if you are the prime provider, you have the sole responsibility of contracting with the endpoint assessment organisation. If endpoint assessment preparation is required, then this needs to be part of the on-program element and needs to be designed into the actual development of the apprenticeship. And then also you need to consider the different endpoint assessment environments. We have had a number of candidates already that have been referred who have been very confident in their occupational trade. And what we have found is that because the environment they're put into, which may be a professional review or that they have to undertake certain types of observation scrutiny, that because they haven't been prepared for that environment, they've found it extremely challenging and has actually affected the output of the endpoint assessment. So that you need to consider not just they're occupationally competent, but they're set to sit in an endpoint assessment environment to complete their apprenticeship. Next page. And as providers, you have also got to deal with many different shapes and sizes of apprenticeships. We currently can see that the types of assessments that are being undertaken are varied. They consider showcase portfolio, knowledge testing, project work, observations, professional reviews, interviews, visas. And many of the apprenticeships have a rich mix of these assessment instruments. So it also means that you need to be able to prepare your apprentice to be able to deal with the diversity that's in there. And also from a logistics point of view, you have to deal with a far greater diverse environment, particularly when you cover a number of occupations within your apprenticeship business. As far as external quality assurance is concerned, there are that is undertaken on the endpoint assessment organisations. There are basically still the four models, which is it could be an employer quality assurance organisation, Ofqual, the Institute of Apprenticeships, or an institution like the IMechE, who does many of the engineering apprenticeships. The Institute of Apprenticeships have decided that they will not actually carry out this role independently themselves. They are currently going through a process of tendering to purchase in endpoint assessment external quality assuring organisations to carry out the role where they have been specified within the standard of being endpoint assessment. There is also a burden of getting it right. There are probably three impacts that we need to consider. Is that if we train the apprentices right, get them to the gateway, ensure that they're good at what they've got to do, and then have the right skill sets to pass endpoint assessment, we need to make sure that the apprentice is not put forward if he isn't really in a position to be successful. From an apprentice point of view, managing a rejection, having to do referral training and development, which is a costly thing for all people, but particularly for apprentices from their own esteem point of view, and having to do it again is clearly an issue that we would like to see very little of going forward. We also need to understand as a provider, the not right first time impacts. It will impact on the success rates for the digital apprenticeship system. It will cause all sorts of issues for getting the apprentice rescheduled and the training for training and the reset, the costs, and also the negotiation with the employer, who clearly would not wish to see this, and the costs which may or may not be covered within the residual funding that's left. And also, from an employer's perspective, that apprentice not being qualified may have some business dependencies and also affect the reputation you as a provider with the employer as a customer. Perhaps we can now take poll 6.
Okay, just moving on to the next poll question. So, have you considered use of apprenticeships to deliver current and new skills in your business? So, yes or no answer. Okay. Well, it looks like a lot of people answered yes, which is simple enough.
Which is really great, because from a perspective of being a provider, and many of you with significant salary bills, then there is great opportunities to develop young and mature talent using the apprenticeship frameworks within your own businesses. Absolutely excellent. What I'd like to do now is turn to looking at endpoint assessment and working with city and guilds. We as an organisation are not in a position to actually provide the endpoint assessment service in isolation. So we are currently creating relationships with organisations, both at different levels, to provide some of the skill sets and resources required to do endpoint assessment. What I'd like to do is take you through some of the relationships that we have, which are with regards to working with you as providers. The first type of relationship is direct delivery. This is the one that you recognise the most. Basically, we will have a product or service, which is endpoint assessment, which may include having an assessor and a venue supplied by sitting guilds, so that endpoint assessment can take place. This is much more like a buy-off-the-shelf service, which you're pretty much used to as you've bought qualifications for us for many decades. So that's our first one. The second model is somewhat similar, but what we are having is a separate relationship with our provider network, where we would want to purchase skill sets of assessors and potential venues for certain occupational areas. However, they will be two separate transactions. One is the normal transaction of purchasing, and where we want to use you as a supplier of skills and venues, having a separate relationship and contract to enable you to work with us so that we can deliver the endpoint assessment environment that's required for the apprenticeships. Third is somewhat more complex. We are currently working with a number of consortiums who have a range of colleges and providers who sit around a common membership type organisation called a consortium. The consortium becomes an interface for city and guilds to work with those colleges. As far as the purchasing of the product or service, that is still a direct relationship between the college and provider and city and guilds. However, we are looking at providing a consortium contract to provide services both from skills, from assessors, and also from providers, from assessors, and venues that will actually undertake the endpoint assessment service. We will be the endpoint assessment organisation, and basically we will contract with the consortium to supply us with those particular services. We have at least one consortium that's ready to go, and we are currently working on several others. But these seem to be the most successful approach currently in engaging with sitting guilds to be able to deliver endpoint assessment in some sort of partnership, supplier partnership. We're now coming to the end of the presentation, and what we'd like to do is that we have we've actually offered you a number of links that are relevant to this particular presentation, if you want to do further follow-up or personal research. And basically what we'd like to do now is open the floor to any questions.
Okay, so if you'd like to get in touch in the question panel, type any questions that you have. So we have a few here already, which I'm going to ask Bill. So the first question is, will City and Guilds be running any endpoint assessment for electrical or will this remain as the AM2?
The current endpoint assessment service for Electrotech, or electrical as you quoted, will continue to be through the AM2 process, which is run by an organisation called NET. City and Guilds have no plans to enter that current marketplace. And we understand that they're probably going to continue to be the sole provider for endpoint assessment services. Okay,
thank you. So the next question, regarding EPA and resits, can you clarify that we can ask for 20% for EPA even if the cost quoted by the EPAO is lower than that, so that we can use the difference for resits? What if a resit isn't required?
Right. The only money that you can claim out of the 20% is only money that you can receipt. So in the first instance, you can make a claim for the endpoint assessment against the receipted value. However, say that the endpoint assessment total value is 20% is worth 2,000, and say that there's basically the endpoint assessment costs 1,500, then once you've made that booking for endpoint assessment, then you can pay the, you can actually make claim for that 1,500. If the candidate is unfortunate and doesn't get through, then you have up to £500 to pay towards a further endpoint assessment as far as the resit is concerned, basically, but it's only against receipted money. So basically, you cannot claim the 20%. Because when you're audited, you would have to demonstrate you have spent all of that money on endpoint assessment. If you haven't, then unfortunately it may be classed as fraud.
Okay. So next question. Is the 20% for EPA 20% of the job banding rate or 20% of the negotiated price with the employer? This
is rather confusing because recently the ESFA decided to actually state that it was 20% of the negotiated price. Recently, the ESFA has revisited this area and said that the 20% is the top, for endpoint assessment, is based on the top value of the band.
Okay. Moving on to the next question. Is City and Guilds only interested in colleges for consortium arrangement? What about independent providers who deliver over 70% of all apprenticeships?
We are currently negotiating with one independent provider network, as well as the consortium of college providers. So yes, we will work with all providers in either the FE network or private providers. All that we need is the right terms and conditions and environment to be able to carry out the transaction.
We have another question here. We will be building apprentice portfolios using an electronic portfolio. I assume we will need to give you access to these portfolios for EPA, or will we need to present these on a different system?
The endpoint, as far as the portfolio scenario is concerned, because there is quite a lot of diversity out there, basically we will have a portal that you can upload the output of your actual electronic portfolios, but they would need to be able to match need to be able to upload it in a way that we can accept on our systems. But we will accept both our own electronic portfolios and other external electronic portfolios as well.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Another question. If we buy a package from City and Guilds for EPA that includes resources, is this okay to be a part of the 20%?
A lot of our products and services that we offer is based on, if you book early with us for endpoint assessment, is that we offer an enhancement of giving you support services as part of a free bundle to accept. So as far as the bundle is concerned, in certain cases like automotive, it has no what we call commercial value, so it can, all you're actually paying for is endpoint assessment. However, we also have other products and services to support on program, which are bought as individual products or services. They will have to be paid for out of the on program element of the funding.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions here. Remember, we do have a lot of time, so please send us any questions that you have. So, next question. Are there different costs for EPA depending on which model you go for? If so, what are
Endpoint assessment is designed by the actual Trailblazer group, the employer group. So everybody will have to run the same endpoint assessment model as far as that goes. There may be flexibilities in it, say through opportunities where virtual interviews can be used, or where some people may be using electronic questionnaires rather than paper-based questionnaires. And clearly each endpoint assessment organisation will have to price its product according to the elements that's within its endpoint assessment. But the actual content of endpoint assessment and what has to be achieved during endpoint assessment should be exactly the same depending upon different endpoint assessment organisations.
Okay. Another question. Do you have any price packages for EPA that you're currently offering? If so, how do we get these?
Currently, there's two ways of getting them. They are currently available on Wall Garden, if you're a City and Guilds organisation, or if not, then what we will do is send a business manager to contact you with a full list of products and services.
Okay.
Prices.
Another question. How would we avoid conflicts of interest in the last two models? E.g., if we as College A have a competitive College B, would it be guaranteed that none of Colleges B's were sent to us for EPA?
As far as this is concerned, this is dealt through the City and Guilds modelling. Basically, they purchase an endpoint assessment service from us, not from the consortium. We may be able to offer them a range of different solutions, different venues for them to sit that endpoint assessment so that the customer can select the most acceptable endpoint assessment solution for their particular candidate, their apprentice.
Okay, next question. Is there a minimum percentage that can be paid per endpoint assessment?
No, there isn't a minimum percentage as far as the endpoint assessment value is concerned. The actual ceiling has been calculated by the ESFA as a reasonable cost for endpoint assessment. Many of them are being charged significantly less, and basically what will happen there is that I've seen some endpoint assessments that have come in at 10% of the funding band, but I haven't seen many lower than that. But that's just down to cost efficiencies of the endpoint assessment organisation and their pricing.
Okay. Next question. Will City and Guilds charge a full endpoint assessment cost or a fraction, depending on what needs to be reassessed?
This is a tricky one from our point of view, because some endpoint assessment requirements do not allow part resets. This has already been dictated to by the employer. In those cases, then a full reset charge will have to be charged. Where we have flexibilities and we are allowed to reset an element of endpoint assessment, which is clearly identified in the assessment plan methodology, then what we do is we obviously give that flexibility and financial benefit to our customers.
Remember, please send through your questions, and any questions that we don't answer today, we'll send through in an email with the Q&A, and we'll get all your questions answered. So we have another question here. Is there standardised training for EPA assessors?
Yeah, each endpoint assessment organisation has to provide the approach that they are going to operate to become licensed to practice. Within that, there are elements that clearly define the skill sets that are required for being an endpoint assessor. The two primary requirements is, one, they have to be occupationally competent and current, and the second being that they have to demonstrate the skill set needed to make good assessment judgments. Within City and Guilds, if you become an assessor on our register, we'll ensure that both those elements are fulfilled.
Thank you, Bill. We don't have any new questions coming through right now, so I think we'll leave it there. And any unanswered questions, we will get back to you. Like I said, we'll send out an email with all the Q&As. So thank you all for dialing in, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.